Welcome to our Conducting a Literature Review session through the Levy Library. And I'll also warn you that my internet has been a little strange lately, so if I go out for just a minute or two, I promise I'm coming back. Here's our agenda, which I'll go over in a minute. I want to encourage everyone to put whatever questions they have in the chat. I have a colleague on the call as well who's going to monitor the chat and make sure that she brings up any relevant questions as they come, and then I'll answer any kind of leftovers by the end of the session. But we're going to start today talking about what is a literature review, what are different forms of literature reviews, which I think is really important to think about as we do what I think is really important, which is to step back and think about our scope and think about our research question before we jump into searching. So then we will jump into a searching demo that we'll do mostly in PubMed, but what I hope I'm going to do is kind of do this demo for you guys in PubMed in a way that is that you can translate across databases, and we'll talk about why that's so important. And then finally, we'll talk about kind of staying organized, outlining your review, and kind of tools like reference managers that are useful when you're writing any type of literature review. So with that said, what is a literature review? So a great literature review effectively and succinctly conveys all relevant information on a given topic. And so I think the word relevant here is really key, and I feel like I'm going to make that clear when I kind of keep talking about scope. So a great literature review does not convey all information, it conveys all relevant information. And what information is relevant really depends on your scope and why you are conducting your literature review. And so what I think is really great about literature reviews is that they are a place where we can explore or introduce a topic in this kind of, we're talking about science and medicine, so I don't want to call anything, purely subjective, but in a way that introduces whatever it is that we'd like to talk about or adds to our personal existing knowledge on a topic. It's really important that a literature review that's seeking to describe a topic area or a concept, identifies gaps and makes recommendations for future study. That's a really important way to kind of show that you've done your work in a literature review. But what's also really important to remember is that a literature review is not a systematic review. So this next slide is a little busy, so I'm obviously not going to go through all of these points, but I think it's really important to point out the differences between a literature review and a systematic review, because I do think that there is a bit of a conception that a literature review and a systematic review are kind of like on a continuum, and a systematic review is really just like a Mondo literature review or something. And that's not the case. They're really different, in nature, even though they both have the word review in them. A systematic review is typically focused on a single question, and it seeks to locate studies, designed and executed in a very similar way to answer that specific, typically clinical question. Whereas a literature review by no means is only looking at studies. A literature review looks at the best available literature on a topic and whatever literature is available to discuss the topic. Again, not necessarily answer a question or provide any kind of data on that question. But that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily want to use systematic search methods and systematic organization methods that we use in a systematic review when we're conducting a literature review. The difference is that what you're undertaking and what you end up with look very different. Thinking about types of literature reviews, there are very, very different types of literature reviews. And that's why it's really important to kind of step back and think about your goal and what you're doing before you start. So some literature reviews are an introduction to a journal article, maybe a study, or an introduction or part of a dissertation or thesis. So these literature reviews are much shorter. So when we're thinking about our scope, we're thinking, we need typically much less yield, much less references. But for a very specific purpose, to introduce and contextualize whatever work we're introducing. Whereas a standalone work, so a review article or maybe a course assignment, those are review articles much more, I would say, driven by the findings, driven by the literature that's being reviewed. So when we're thinking about our scope and our purpose, when we're thinking about what we need to remember kind of like what is my point here? What is my end goal? So I'm going to launch our poll, and I would love for everyone to just kind of let me know if you kind of signed up for this session because you're working on a literature review, what type of literature review are you working on? And if you're not working on a literature review, maybe you could just tell me like what you were thinking when you saw the title of this class. Like what you think of as a typical literature review. So we'll give like 30 seconds for that. Okay, so I am going to share these results with you guys. So what it looks like is the kind of the biggest answer here was a literature review as part of a journal article. So that's great to know. And so I think it's really important, kind of like I've been saying, to step back and remind yourself, when you're writing a literature review like that, what your purpose is, what you're introducing, and the fact that, there's only so much information you need. You don't need to kind of like necessarily make yourself crazy when you're searching for a literature review of that nature. So, like I say, when we're thinking about defining the scope of our review, we want to kind of think, what types of publications am I looking for? So when we're searching, and I'll probably note this multiple times because I think it's really important to remember, but when we're searching databases like PubMed and even Google Scholar and, Embase or, wherever, these kind of like standard databases that we think about, we need to remember that we're typically searching journal articles. And so we need to remember that if the scope of my literature review, might include like white papers, government documents, patient information, maybe, we need to remember that that information is not going to be, coming up in our results list in PubMed. That doesn't mean we can't, that doesn't mean it's not accessible to us, but it requires kind of stepping back and being like, okay, what else is part of my search strategy here? It's not just about keywords, but it's about where am I going? We also want to think like, okay, what can we reasonably expect to find? If we're doing a literature review, on an emerging, on the coronavirus, COVID-19, I wouldn't say coronavirus, on COVID-19, we're not going to have patient data from 10 years ago. We might say like, okay, what, I need to think outside the box. What kind of other, historical aspects can I bring in to contextualize? But we need to think about, study design and, timeliness when we're thinking about like, okay, what can we expect? We're not going to just find, like 10 perfect RCTs on every topic we want. Maybe be a much healthier world, I guess. So we also want to think, is this a selective or comprehensive review? We want to kind of think about this beforehand so we don't make ourselves crazy later on. If what we're writing is a selective review, if we're writing a review simply to introduce our own work, then our goal is not to find and review and synthesize all of the literature, on this certain intervention or on this new, on this new diagnostic method that we're talking about here. Our goal is to kind of present the problem, prove the reason this was necessary, and move forward with the meat of our paper. And then finally, we want to make sure that we are aware of like themes and prominent experts in the field when we're thinking about the scope of our review, kind of thinking about the way that whatever we're writing about is typically presented can potentially flow through our work as well. So I have a colleague who says that this image reminds her of eyeglasses, but if we look closely and realize that it's not a pair of eyeglasses, what we want to realize is that the literature review, kind of regardless of why we're performing a literature review, it's always a process. It's always this iterative process where we start with an information need or kind of this like literature review idea or need in our head and kind of this like perfect, this perfect idea, and then it involves going to the literature, seeing what's there, and then in most cases needing to revise our information need and think more about what we need and how we're going to present it based on what we've found. So just like my literature review that introduces my study on this new diagnostic method is going to be driven by, you know, making the case for my study, it will also be driven by what's already out there. I can't write a literature review on what's not there. So it needs to kind of be, those two need to go hand in hand. So are there any questions at this stage? I don't see any in the chat. So I'm gonna just plow ahead, but feel free to put questions in there at any time. So we're gonna talk about searching. So I am sure from looking at, you know, the advanced search screen on some databases, even if we've never actually employed these Boolean operators ourselves, although I'm sure many of us have, I am sure the and, or, and not are familiar to us. But I do think a lot of us think that in the age of Google, we don't need to think about you know, these Boolean operators. We think we can just kind of do a plain language search into Google Scholar, and we're good. And a lot of the time that is true, but I hope what I can do is kind of show you guys the utility of this and or syntax. So very often in literature and in language, medical literature, that multiple terms are used to describe the same thing. For example, we could say therapy or management or intervention, not necessarily all the exact same thing, but they're related. And so what we want to do is kind of, we don't want to put ourselves in a box based on the phrases that we use. We want to kind of find literature in an unbiased way. And so what we want to do is use our literature searching process to add more keywords and add more synonyms to our searches so that we can create searches that combine synonyms so that we can search for multiple concepts. So in this case here, my example here at the bottom, we're searching for hormone or estrogen and therapy and heart disease or hypertension. So think about this as like a triple Venn diagram. We're saying like, okay, give me anything with hormone or estrogen, could be either, has to have therapy, and it has to have heart disease or hypertension. So it's kind of like a checklist of 3 items. And so we're expanding our search with these ors, but then when we say, okay, but it also has to be with therapy, then that's when we kind of limit ourselves. So we want to kind of think like, okay, what are the pillars holding my search up? What are my concepts? Like, the hormones, the therapy, and, the heart disease. But what are other ways that people might describe that so I don't miss anything? So my next slide might explain it better, might explain it worse, probably depends on the person. But let's say I'm thinking like, okay, I want articles on vegetarian diet and heart disease. I want to see where the research is, what's going on here. What are different terms that people might use to describe vegetarian diet? And so there's probably a lot more than I have listed here. And then I did the same thing with heart disease. And that, kind of involved in this case, which I'll kind of explain a little bit more when we go into PubMed, but that involved maybe kind of expanding myself beyond heart disease, where I say cardiac disease or cardiovascular disease. And then creating a search that basically, expands what I'm looking for by telling the database like, okay, I'm okay with vegetarian or vegan or meatless, but it has to be combined with heart disease or cardiovascular disease or cardiac disease. So it's a way of, expanding yourself, but expanding your results, but also, trying to make sure you don't get anything totally irrelevant. So I'm gonna kind of go quickly through this slide, but for people that are familiar with the PICO format, which is, a format that we use to kind of think about clinical questions, so kind of like on the fly clinical questions, I do think this same kind of idea of breaking our question down by concept is very similar to the PICO format, where what we're typically doing in the PICO format is taking an information need or potentially taking, a specific patient and doing some work in our mind and breaking things down to turn that question into what the literature looks like. In this case, study design, how are studies designed? So really what kind of my vegetarian my vegetarian and heart disease example does is takes my question like, I wonder, which is basically, I wonder if my vegetarian diet makes me at less risk for heart disease. It turns that into a, a comprehensive, but also organized way to search the literature. So, like I said, we are going to go right into, I do see some questions that I don't want to skip though, so maybe I will go back. So I see, when you are writing a paper on a novel finding, how would you go about doing an exhaustive lit review to confidently say your findings are new? I'm going to come back to that question. And then how many articles, sources are necessary for a good literature review? That is, I can't, because there's so many different types of literature reviews, I can't give you a number. But what I would say is if you are working on a literature review for a journal article, then that all you need to do is look at the limits of the journal, as well as maybe some other recently published papers in your target journal. And I can expand on that at the end if you'd like. And what was the meaning of the asterisks in slide 16? So the meaning of the asterisks, so sorry I didn't explain that, was if in many databases, PubMed being one of them, but not all of them, an asterisk can act as truncation. So it could be heart disease or heart diseases. So it's useful, but it's also something you want to be careful with. So let's talk about PubMed. So I will say, first and foremost, I absolutely love PubMed. Love it, love it, love it. Spend most of my time on there. But I do think it's this place that we jump to really quickly for our searching, because it's so comprehensive. But I think when we are jumping somewhere so quickly, we need to remember what we're potentially missing. So I think it's important to remember what PubMed is. So PubMed is a biomedical database maintained by the National Library of Medicine. In some form, it's been in existence since, I want to say the 1950s, but potentially even earlier, obviously not on its, in digital form. And then within PubMed is the database MEDLINE. So when someone says MEDLINE PubMed, that they're really talking about the same thing. It's more kind of like PubMed is the vehicle for searching MEDLINE, and MEDLINE is like the stuff, the database. And there are other places that we can search MEDLINE. But what's important to remember is these are biomedical citations to journal articles. And these are journal articles that have been, I don't want to say vetted, but, technically vetted and approved by the National Library of Medicine for inclusion in this database. So for example, if we have if I'm doing a literature review on how hospitals, reorganized for the Affordable Care Act, and there's one great article in JAMA, and there's one great article in the Harvard Business Review, I'm not getting that Harvard Business Review article in PubMed, regardless of how relevant it is, regardless of how similar to that JAMA article it is, whereas I am getting that JAMA article. So it's really important to remember that we are constrained by the journal inclusion in PubMed, and the fact, like I said earlier, that it is just journal articles. So if I'm reading a paper and it says, in its annual diabetes report, the CDC reported blah, 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 I can't go to PubMed and find that CDC report. And so I need to think about that from the position of the searcher, where I'm not, if that CDC report is something I'd like to include in my own work, that's not something that's coming up, nice and easy for me when I search PubMed. It needs to occur to me that there might be some other places to search. But that's not to say that you can't use the journal articles that you find in PubMed to link yourself to these other resources. And so I'll give a little bit of a kind of a tip for how to do that after we look at PubMed. And then finally, PubMed Central. I am sure all of you have seen, you've been on PubMed and you've seen it say like free PMC article. So that's a much, much smaller, obviously not small, it's millions, but a much, much smaller database of articles that are completely freely available. Most of the time, the reason they're freely available is because they were the study that they're presenting was funded by the NIH, at least in part. Not always though, but it's a much smaller subset. But you would never want to search just PMC itself, because look at how much you are losing out on. So we are going to take a look at PubMed. So I'm going to start on the Levy Library website. Oh, and I want to just, okay, cool. Start on the Levy Library website. And we do have this PubMed bar here. That's fine, but I always just recommend using this link here. And so what you'll see, the reason is, okay, great example. I'm happy this happened. The reason that we want to use the Levy Library link is that it asks us to log in right away, which is great because then most of the time, hopefully whenever I click on an article, I've already logged into the library and I'm going to have access to the full text. And so I can answer questions about access when I finish up as well. So let's think about a basic search. So if I hadn't kind of done all that work on that slide to think about all my synonyms. So if I just go vegetarian and heart disease. And, that's probably, these results look great. I think this is interesting. But I want to think about like what PubMed potentially did to my search. And a better way to actually see that is to look at display options here. And let's change this to most recent. So when we switch away from best match, our results are going to get way less exciting. But what's interesting to look at is, so let's look at this first article. So I see vegetarian, so I totally understand, why this article came up, but I don't see anything about heart disease. It obviously is talking about, the risk factors for heart disease, but I don't see heart disease anywhere. And so why did this come up in my search? And, it's relevant, so I'm like, oh, thank you. But I want to understand why. So if I go to my advanced search tab, so sorry, let's pretend I was on my results, and then I click advanced. So if I'm here, I see I searched vegetarian and heart disease, pretty simple. But if I click this little arrow under details, actually what PubMed did is it expanded my search based on a mapping and tagging system that it has in the background. And so this is why I think PubMed is a really, really great place to start your searches, even though it's not where I would say to, totally complete all your searches. Because I searched vegetarian and it translated that to the mesh term diet, vegetarian, as well as the mesh term vegetarians, as well as some more keywords. And heart disease, we got heart diseases, the mesh term, as well as some other keywords that it added for me. So it even truncated it without me asking, because these are words that are kind of pre-programmed in the background in PubMed. And so that's great that happened, but that doesn't always happen. So in this case, it kind of worked out perfectly. But what we want to do is figure out how to kind of like play the system so we can make sure this always happens to our searches. So if I go back to my search results, and maybe this time I will sort by best match. So if we go back to these search results and I'm like, oh, this is great. What I want to do is see how was this article tagged with mesh terms. So in our new PubMed, we scroll all the way to the bottom through the similar articles, through the cited by, and we can see these are the mesh terms that it was tagged with. So mesh stands for medical subject headings. And what that is these are predetermined kind of like, I would say, like approved terms, kind of like an approved dictionary for any article that comes into the MEDLINE database. Remember MEDLINE and PubMed are the same thing. So these are approved terms where even if I write, if I wrote, plant-based diet and heart attack as my article title, that's going to get tagged with diet, vegetarian, or maybe diet, vegan, as we can see here. So it's really, really important to be aware of these terms because they do this great job of kind of culling together everything that we're interested in, regardless of kind of like variances in the way that people describe things. But it's also really important to kind of think like, oh, wait, I need to be aware of using keywords as well. Because think about that example I just gave. My article is called plant-based. These are tagged by human beings. maybe some of these indexers would tag that as vegetarian, maybe some as vegan. And obviously these people are reading the papers, they are doing their best, but it's important to remember that there's potential human error in here. So that's why we want to kind of be aware of these mesh terms, bring them into our search, but then also include whatever keywords we can think of. So this is one way to kind of find our mesh terms, and we can click on them and click search in mesh, and that'll take us to the mesh database. But I'm actually going to show you guys another way to get to the mesh database. So if I am on my PubMed homepage, which is now being blocked by a little zoom bar. Okay, we're back. So if I'm on the PubMed homepage and I have the mesh database here, I'll click here. And so now you'll see we're back to the old PubMed interface. They haven't updated this page yet, but now I'm going to search mesh, not searching PubMed anymore. So it's like I'm searching the dictionary. So let's just search, let's search heart attack. We'll see. I think we all probably know what they're going to say the mesh term is for that one. And so they're saying like, okay, someone could write heart attack in their title, but we're going to tag it with myocardial infarction. And so we also see all of these entry terms that are included when basically this means anytime someone goes in and, like me, searches, you know, if I go in and search heart attack, it's going to search heart attack for me, but it's going to map to this mesh term as well. So that's that mapping I showed you guys in the background. And finally, I think the most useful aspect of this for a literature review and for thinking about your literature review is this tree structure. So all of these mesh terms are in a tree structure. And what's great is that in PubMed, when you search a mesh term, it will automatically search for you anything tagged with that mesh term, as well as anything tagged with a mesh term that's below it in a tree. So for my project, I'm like, oh, okay, I can go up to heart diseases. That's what I'll search. But maybe I also want to go, maybe I've decided I want to go all the way up to cardiovascular diseases, you know, based on the keywords that I decided on in my slide. Maybe I do want to go up that high, especially if I'm going to be thinking about like risk factors and stuff like that. So what I can do is, so I'm still in this kind of mesh system. And now if we look below, there's so many things below cardiovascular diseases. And so I will add that to my search builder. And so I can just search PubMed. And I've searched that for just cardiovascular diseases as a mesh term. That's a ton of stuff, right? But what if I go back to mesh and I'm like, okay, now I need to add my vegan or vegetarian. So again, to see, I'll search vegan. And I think this is interesting. We have vegans and we have diet, vegan. So what I'm interested in is obviously diet, vegan, but I might want to be safe and just search both, just to be careful. Again, remembering that these are kind of human beings doing this tagging. And so I see, if I look at my tree structure, that diet vegan is actually under diet vegetarian. So now I don't even need to worry about searching the mesh term for vegan, because if I search vegetarian, I'm going to get them both. And then maybe I'll just go and find that vegetarian person one. Yes, vegetarians. And I think we can all guess that vegans is housed under there as well. And so I'll change this to or, add it to my search builder. And now I'm searching PubMed for anything related to diet vegetarian or vegetarians, as well as anything below it, which we now know is vegans. And so what I can do in here, so now I'm back in my advanced builder and it's saving all of my searches. And so what I can do is I can say, okay, add query. So I've added my diet vegetarian or vegetarians, and then I can add with and. So now I've created this search that tells PubMed, give me a Venn diagram between anything tagged with these vegetarian mesh terms and anything tagged with cardiovascular disease or anything below it. So this search is going to have a quite, I think, higher yield than my vegetarian heart disease, because I've expanded it. I've expanded it from heart disease up to cardiovascular disease. And then my best practice, so I don't have too much time to kind of go into this, but my best practice for a literature search would be to play around with your keywords. So what I have here is cardiovascular diseases, but if we remember on my slide here, I had, let me get back to this, I had actually come up with all of these other terms that authors might be using. And so these terms could be based on my previous knowledge. It could be based on, you know, I'm kind of coming up with them as I'm searching. And then so as long as I'm staying in the parentheses, I can add these, and then remember, I'm only expanding my search when I add things with or. And let's say, why don't I just do the same thing for vegetarian? And so again, you know, you do need to kind of play around and figure out like what works, what doesn't, because obviously we know there's many more terms I could add, right? I could add meatless, or I'd have meatless. I could add plant-based. I could add whatever. There's probably terms I don't know about. And so sometimes adding those terms just gets you too much because you accidentally start to veer into another topic. And then sometimes it's what you need to do to find what you need. And you're not limited to 2 pillars by any means. I could obviously go, you know, and then add like pregnancy or something. But so I quickly searched. And so I ended up almost, you know, more than doubling my results. That's not necessarily a good thing. It could be good. It could kind of show us what we needed to see. We could be finding more relevant results, but we could have found a lot of irrelevant results. And so that's why this is an iterative process. And I might realize like, oh, you know, I really shouldn't have expanded to cardiovascular diseases, and I needed to kind of keep things tighter. And so that's why it's important to kind of play around. And that's how I think when the process of conducting a literature review and this process of searching is actually how we, you know, learn about what's out there and learn about, you know, our topic area. So I'm going to check the chat for just a minute. Oh, and it looks like Lily is answering questions. So I will ignore the chat, but Lily, feel free to vocally interrupt me if you want at any time. So what I want to point out now that we've kind of looked at the difference between this kind of like, you know, comprehensive mesh and keyword search, as well as, you know, this really basic search that we started with, what I want to look at is kind of how we would look through our results. So on PubMed, so again, we are focusing on PubMed right now. What I want to point out is under display options, something really useful for scrolling through results that we can do on display options is click abstract. And then we get the full abstract, you know, it's bigger, but then we get the full abstract of each paper as we're scrolling, which makes it a lot easier, and you don't end up with like 1,000 tabs open at a time and like all these articles that you're going to read the abstract for at some point. You can read the abstract and then, only save it or add it to your collection if you'd like to. Another thing I want to point out are the filters available in PubMed. So these filters here are my NCBI filters. So these are some filters that I put here kind of custom because I have this MyNCBI account. I'm not going to go into the MyNCBI account today, but I really, really recommend if you find yourself on PubMed, you know, really any more than like once a month, I really recommend having a MyNCBI account, because what you can do is you can save your searches. Because I'm logged in, I can click create alert and save this search and then come back to it and rerun it whenever I'd like. So I'll really quickly just show you guys what that looks like. So if I go to the dashboard, it shows you all the searches that you have saved. And what's great is that these searches that I have saved, it tells me the last time I ran it, and it tells me how many articles have come up within that search since that time. So this JAK inhibitor search, even though I ran it 3 months ago, only 8 new articles have come out. Compare that to 2 months ago, my COVID-19 search, almost 3,000 articles have come out. So it's a really cool way to kind of keep tabs on things. And if you spend the time to create a comprehensive search like this, it's a great idea to save it. If you don't feel like making an account, something like this could easily just be copy and pasted onto like a Google Doc, and you can just copy and paste it back into PubMed whenever you'd like. I do recommend saving some record of what you're searching for like a longer term project. But what I do want to point out are the filters. So in addition to scrolling through and looking at the abstract, what I want to point out are the filters here. So I don't recommend using these filters too much. Specifically because most of these filters are based on tags. They're based on tags that the indexers, the same indexers who give the, who provide the mesh terms, put onto the articles. So they'll say, oh, this is a meta-analysis or this is a randomized control trial. But if we look at the additional filters, specifically under article type, there are just so many that I think it gets, specifically if we're thinking about a literature review, I just think it gets pretty, it just gets too detailed to really rely on these filters. So what I recommend doing instead, if you're looking for studies specifically, is actually using the clinical journals, the clinical queries. So here I am on PubMed's main page, and if I click clinical queries, I can actually run a search that will try to get me only studies. So I'll do this really quickly. And this is not something I would necessarily recommend for your complete literature review search, but it's a great way to see what studies are available. So this is my exact same search. And so what this clinical study arm does over here on the left is it says, okay, you can choose the type of study you're interested in, and you can choose if you want kind of like only, very high level of evidence studies, that would be narrow, or if you want to keep things broad. And then you can look specific. So that's one way to kind of get rid of like reviews and editorials and stuff like that. I would recommend that above the filters. But what I do recommend is using the date filter. So that's really something to think about in terms of, kind of your scope. There are many situations where you might just need to tell yourself, like, I don't need to look at papers that are more than, 10 years old. And maybe that's just because there's so much in a topic, or maybe you can actually pinpoint a date where something happened in this field that you can kind of be like, okay, we can kind of step back from anything before that point. So I want to return to my slides and discuss beyond PubMed. So moving beyond PubMed. So I'm sure Google Scholar is a place where most of us start our literature searching. It's definitely a place where I start my literature searching because it's a great place where we can put in a search, and it'll do, it'll use its crazy expensive Google algorithm, and it'll get us really relevant articles, and it'll get us highly cited articles. And I'm going to show you how it does that in a second. But when it comes to thinking beyond PubMed, what I want to kind of urge everyone to look at Web of Science or Scopus, at least not necessarily instead, but at least in addition to Google Scholar. So we go beyond PubMed because we want to leave this biomedical kind of bubble that we're in. We want to make sure that there's nothing maybe, in the sociology literature, the business literature, totally depends on your topic, and these databases like Google Scholar are a place to do that. But what we can do in these databases is also connect articles. So the way that I like to kind of begin in Scopus or Web of Science, and so again, the way I kind of define Scopus and Web of Science is databases they're academic, but they're not subject specific. So even though Web of Science has the word science in it, they are not subject specific the way that PubMed is. So if we take a look at our homepage, here we have under popular tools, we have Scopus linked. And if we wanted to access Web of Science, we would just click on databases and find it there. But since Scopus is right here, we'll use that. Even though, if I'm being honest, I prefer Web of Science, but that's subjective. And so I copied the title of that really relevant article. And so what I like to do is drop down here and change to article title, and then find that article. And so then what I can do is start to get a handle on what direction this research might be going. And meaning this is a really relevant article, who is citing this article? So if I click here, I can see cited by 133 documents. So sorry, that took a minute to load, but then I can click view all 133 citing documents. So this is really, really useful when we're kind of trying to trace a small area or something emerging or something just really rare, to really make sure we haven't missed anything, because I know that's everyone's biggest fear. But this is a really great way to kind of see who's citing who, to see where the literature is going. But what we can also do is create our own search in this database. So if I kind of navigate back to title, abstract, and keywords, and I'm going to just quickly, so I'll go, heart disease or cardiovascular, and then I'll say vegetarian. And so this is exactly why I like to start in PubMed, because when I started in PubMed with my idea like vegetarian and heart disease, it did so much work for me. It expanded it. Going through MESH kind of got me thinking about how I might want to broaden, and it gave me this nice like kind of tight view of the literature. Whereas here, we don't have any of that mapping. This is way too big of a database for them to be doing that, unfortunately. So we really, our keywords are much, much more important. So it's great to kind of do that work, thinking about them in PubMed, and then come to a database like this. So I will search, and I didn't search meatless or plant-based at all, which was a mistake. But then what I can do is look at my results. And so what I want to point out is that in Scopus, we have something really useful. So here by this sort on, it's a little weird that it says sort on and not sort by. But if we do the drop down, what we can do is we can sort by cited by highest. You can also sort by cited by lowest. But this is something we can't do in most databases. And this is a really quick way to see, okay, what are the very, very highly cited articles in this field? Like, what do I potentially not want to miss? And so this is a really kind of quick way to see those without, which is something you can't do in PubMed. Like I said, Google Scholar, so I went back to the library homepage, I'm going to use our Google Scholar link. Google Scholar sometimes does something similar, but kind of without us asking it to. So if I search heart disease and vegetarian, if we take a look, these are, okay, it's not as extreme as I thought it was going to be, but we have like cited by 300, all of these are high, our first few articles are very highly cited articles. And so, then we'll be like, then we notice, okay, they're pretty old, because, to have that many citations, you have to have been around for a while. So that's something we notice. That's something that's really important to notice about Google Scholar is like, in Scopus, I had to say, okay, do that. But Google Scholar is doing that automatically. So it's important when we search Google Scholar to realize that we're probably not getting the most recent and potentially not even the most relevant articles at the top, because it's Google. They're showing us the most highly visited, the most highly trafficked pages. And so it's important to kind of be aware of that and potentially use these date filters to mitigate that Google algorithm there. But again, we do get the same cited by that we can use. I would never say don't use Google Scholar. So one other thing that we can do that I recommend doing in Scopus that I kind of said I didn't recommend doing in PubMed is using the document type filter. So here what we can do is we can limit by document type. So it's not as specific as those PubMed document types, so it's a little bit easier to use. And what's really useful is that we can limit to conference paper. PubMed does not have any conference abstracts in it. If you ever find one in there, it's most likely there on accident. But Scopus does have them. And for certain topics, conference abstracts and conference papers are, sometimes the bulk of the literature. And I see that when I'm helping people with literature reviews often. So if we quickly limit to conference paper, we're quickly limiting to stuff that we know we didn't see in PubMed. Okay. So moving on from Scopus, and Lily, like I said, feel free to interrupt me. But moving on from Scopus to subject-specific databases. So obviously PubMed is not the only subject-specific database in the world. You'll often, kind of think like, actually, this isn't really a biomedical topic. This is more of a kind of, a psych topic or a, kind of like a healthcare administration topic. So what you want to do is use library resources to make sure you're aware of the other subject-specific databases that might be relevant for your research. So this is just a quick, kind of a quick table of the most popular ones. But what I recommend doing is going to the library website, clicking our databases link right here under Browse Collections, and then using our subjects drop down here. So if I'm like, wow, like I'm a resident but right now I'm looking into something that's kind of more like legal and looking into maybe like medical malpractice as a big part of my lit review. I need legal databases, but I have no idea what those are. What I can do is click here, and then it's going to show me, oh, okay, like best bet, Business Insights, Nexus Uni, which used to be LexisNexis. And so that shows me where I should be searching. But there's something else very, very important you should do in that situation, which is email the library and make an appointment with the librarian, because you should always be doing that for all of your literature searches. So moving on. Why search more than one source? So I think I've kind of made it clear why it's so important based on content. So there's a ton of overlap between these databases. For example, I would say the lion's share of PubMed is in Scopus and Web of Science and even technically Google Scholar. But there's also really, really different functionality. Like I said, when I ran that one search in PubMed and it expanded it for me and it did all that work, based on what happened when I ran that same search in Scopus, really, really different kind of functionality things are happening. So even though there might be similarities in coverage, what's happening to your search behind the scenes is different. So it's really important to jump around and make sure you take advantage of that across databases. So a big question we get is, how do I know when to stop? So I would say sometimes my party line is what I have here, which is you're seeing the same articles over and over. You kind of keep recognizing the titles. Every time you see a highly cited article, it's like, oh, I've seen that one before. You see, you see the same authors. Like I like to say, it's like you feel like you're in a bubble, kind of. You're like knocking against the walls. But what I think is even more important is stepping back and thinking about your scope. So all of the bullet points on this slide are related to if you're running a literature review that's supposed to be like completely comprehensive, but that's actually rarely the case, right? What you actually want to do is kind of step back and think about your scope and think about, what did I kind of achieve my goal? Did I find what I needed to do? Do I have what I need to introduce, my study, whatever I'm introducing? So questions at this point, maybe because I just searched, I'll take a look at the chat box.
Hi, Sam, it's Lily. So there's just one question that I seem to have missed earlier, and it's when you're writing literature review, how do you know, or how do you explain your search methodology, the terms you search, the mesh terms?
That's a great question. So that is definitely why I said, when we were in PubMed before, that's why I said you should always just be kind of quickly copying and pasting your search into a Word doc. And so the practice of reporting your search strategy is something that comes from systematic reviews. But I have noticed that some journals recently, for total literature reviews, are asking you to kind of to report your search strategy. So what I would typically say is what you want to think about reporting is where, when, and how. So what databases did you search? So, we searched PubMed, Scopus, and Google Scholar on, in January 2019. And I think for a literature review, it is enough to say, using a relevant combination of subject headings and keywords, or mesh headings and keywords, you know, related to heart disease and vegetarian diet. For a literature review, I think that's more than enough. So where, when, and how, but your how, if you're not conducting a systematic review, I don't think you should or need to take up space listing all of your terms in the text. Things are changing, journals are getting weird. So if they ask you to do that, that's why it's great that you've saved your searches, because then you have those terms there, and you can say, you know, a variety of terms related to heart disease and vegetarian diet, such as vegan, meatless. You know, if that's how they want to take up space, that's great. But I think that, you know, that first option is better. But I recommend saving for that purpose. Let me know if that doesn't answer your question, but I will move on to reviewing and organizing your findings. So there's kind of a lot of recommendations here, and everyone has their own, you know, everyone has kind of like what they do and how they stay organized. But I really, really recommend using a reference management tool and or like an Excel or a Google Sheets to stay organized, so that you have a visual of what you've kind of amassed. So it's not necessarily just a bunch of PDFs or a bunch of like titles listed on a Word document. And so what you can do with something like a Google Sheet or a reference manager is create groups and start to group things, and then use annotation tools and use note-taking tools to kind of note like where something might go in your review. And then what it also does is kind of points out, it shows you your literature search or your literature review in kind of this like visual way. So on the next slide, I have an example of what a sheet might look like, a summary table that you could create in Google Sheets or Excel might look like. And what I want to focus on here is this manuscript section. So at the beginning, remember, you kind of thought about your scope, and hopefully you potentially thought about the different sections of your manuscript. And so what this person's sheet is showing them is, wow, you know, I didn't find enough for my special population section. Is that because I didn't search correctly, and you know, there's stuff to be found out there, or is that actually something interesting about the body of literature that I can point out in my review? So it's this nice kind of visual way to see that. And that's something that I think you could do in a reference manager as well, using the organization features there. So I really, really recommend drafting an outline because it really gives you, and it helps you develop your scope. So in most cases, you know how long your literature review needs to be based on, you know, if you're writing a comprehensive literature review, or if, you know, your co-authors are like, okay, you only have 250 words, that's it. You know how long it needs to be, and then you can kind of break out your sections, and thinking about the word count, it gets a little less stressful, and it helps you think about how much space you have to talk about different aspects or different topics. And I'll kind of say this is a bit of a backtrack, but my search demo was obviously about, you know, one topic. It would be, never think that, you know, just because it's a literature review, you should only have one literature search. For example, if I was writing a literature review on heart disease and diabetes, or sorry, heart disease and vegetarian diets, I would probably also need a literature search that just maybe got at, you know, the rates of heart disease in, you know, the general population for comparison. So it's not, you'll likely never get everything you need from like that one search. It doesn't really work that way. But continuing to think about creating an outline, my biggest tip for an outline is the same that it is for a literature review. Your literature review, just like your outline, should be based on your purpose, your objective, as well as what you found. You can't write a literature review on what doesn't exist, but your objective and whatever you're introducing or wherever you started what you're doing should remain really important as well. So you need to kind of balance those two. And then when it comes to creating an outline, what I really recommend for each section, I like to kind of start with like a main idea or a topic sentence. So then it's like I've already started writing. And what I find really useful is to kind of use bullet points below that. And for each, so under each topic sentence, it'll say like, you know, like Walsh et al., page 6, and then, you know, maybe a little quote or something. I won't necessarily bring that exact wording into my paper, but it's, you know, it's like I'm starting to create this recipe with my outline, and then I basically just need to go back and fill it in with nice language. So it's a really, really great way to kind of like build yourself up to actually sitting down and writing. Finally, reference managers. I alluded to these a bit when I was talking about organization, and if you are undertaking any kind of literature search, literature review, we really, really recommend using a reference manager. So what a reference manager does is it creates perfectly formatted citations for you. And that's kind of what they're famous for, but it actually does so much more than that. It serves as this organizational tool where you can be searching across databases and always bringing in, you know, articles and PDFs from wherever you're finding them and storing them there and creating groups and stuff. So I'm going to quickly show us. So under research support, our reference management guide is right here. So this is where you can take a look at our guides to EndNote and Zotero. You can look at a little comparison chart, and then download whichever reference manager you think works the best for you. People always say, like, which is better? Which should I use? I just recommend using whatever you like better, but also whatever your colleagues are using, because you can collaborate with co-authors if you're using the same reference management software. So I will return to, and so I mentioned meeting with a librarian earlier, so I want to expand upon that. So in addition to teaching sessions like this, most of what Lily and I do is meeting with students, faculty, residents, staff, whoever in the Mount Sinai community to help with literature searching, reference management. We work on systematic reviews. So anytime that you have a project that you think that you might need kind of help with a literature search with, even if you just want to kind of make sure you're doing it right and you want to check, you should always meet with us to kind of make sure. And we can also help you. That was a great question about how to phrase your literature search. We can also help you with that. That's a question I get more and more, because I think journals are requiring that more and more. I also want to point out the writing support service. So this service is only available to students, residents, and fellows and postdocs at Mount Sinai, but it's a great service where you can meet one-on-one with a writing support consultant who, you know, while we can help you maybe plan and organize and think about what you might want to include in a literature review, and of course with the searching, that's our favorite part, this person will really help you with kind of like the nitty-gritty of writing and the flow and everything like that. And she comes from the publishing industry, the scientific publishing industry, so she does really know kind of what they're looking for better or worse. I want to draw everyone's attention to some upcoming sessions. So I mentioned reference management. We have an EndNote session next week, a Zotero session, not till August, but please register for and attend our upcoming sessions. We'd love to see you, and I will take any more questions. Yes, so I see a question about slides. I'm not going to email them to all attendees because it's not possible, but please feel free. Here's my email on this slide. Please feel free to email me for the slides, and I'm happy to send them to you. Okay, so this kind of concludes our session, but if anyone has any further questions, Lily and I are here to answer them. Thanks so much for attending.